Don't forget that the the topic assignment is due tomorrow, so make sure to submit what your topic is for your research paper. If you have any last-minute questions or need to run some things by me, of course I'll be checking my email through today and tomorrow. And you can certainly come by during office hours. I'll be in my office this afternoon if you need to talk with me about it, but make sure to complete that tomorrow. As I mentioned before, this is not an ironclad agreement in the sense of you have to do this topic once you submit it, but you should at least have something rather pinned down, because the research paper is due toward the middle of March, so it's going to be coming up pretty quickly. So having a topic, working on that as soon as possible will be important for making sure to get the paper in on time. The other thing is to keep up with the reading quizzes. Some of you are kind of falling behind in the reading quizzes. I will drop a couple, and so it won't have a big effect. But if you continue to miss those, that will build up and have an impact on your grade. So don't forget those reading quizzes. There's one due just about every class session, so make sure to come to class having completed those. We're in the midst of talking about the 17th century. On Monday, we were talking about the development of slavery. We noted that it was something that European slavery, in this sense, especially in the colonial context, was something that developed in the 15th century. In the 15th century, but it really exploded in the 17th century in the numbers of people that were enslaved, as well as the number of people involved in the slave trade. And that largely happened as it became more economical for people to use slaves, acquire slaves, in endeavors like farming of tobacco, farming of other crops like indigo and rice, and then of course in the 18th century, toward the end of the 18th century, cotton will become very important in that as well. And so there wasn't as much of an economic push for slavery until the 17th century. And as Africans were enslaved and brought to the colonies, eventually the issue became a Christian one, a theological one as well. As more and more people throughout the 18th century especially began to question, how does Christianity and the process of owning people, how do those things combine? In the 17th century, however, there isn't as much of an issue widespread. We did talk about Bartolome de las Casas in the 16th century. Certainly there were others that would have been raising this issue, but there wasn't as much of an outcry as we'll see in the 18th century and especially in the 19th century, not only in the United States but in other places like Great Britain as well. The other thing, of course, to begin thinking about is that one of the other issues that was connected with this, so economics is connected with this, but another issue was the idea of missionizing the slaves, attempting to convert or evangelize the slaves. And so we see in the 17th century the beginning of what we might call modern African Christianity, or slave Christianity as well. Christianity had been in Africa very early on. Christianity was present in the 3rd century, 4th century, and it had been spreading throughout Africa from that time. But with the rise of Islam had made a lot of impact in Africa. And so while there was a minimal presence of Christianity in Africa in the modern period, right, as we get to the 14th, 15th century, places like Ethiopia, other places where there would have been versions of Orthodox Christianity. One example of that currently maintains is the Coptic Church in Egypt, which is suffering a lot of persecution from a variety of Islamic forces in Egypt. But one of the things that we see is that there is much more of a presence, much more success from Muslims in Africa from the 8th century on. And so predominantly, at the time we're talking about, there are still a lot of traditional practices, traditional African indigenous religions, a lot of practice of Islam, and minor presence of Christianity. But from the 17th century on, we see more and more people of African descent connected to Christianity. Now, some of that has to do with Christians enslaving people and then converting them, or teaching them, or forcing them to convert. But in this early time period, one of the things that seems to be going on as far as why are some Africans, and especially some slaves, moving towards Christianity. Well, one of the things that we can see is that there's a lot of commonality between Christianity and traditional African religions, especially around the concept of the unseen realm. And so this was an area where there was some success of Christian missionaries in attempting to evangelize Africans and then eventually slaves. The unseen realm was the place where the spirits lived. It was something that was real. Furthermore, both groups believed in the possibility of revelation occurring from this realm. Additionally, there was almost in both groups the belief in the need for revelation. We understand the unseen realm because those on the other side have revealed it to us. Now, certainly there were differences between traditional African religions and Christianity over what's in the unseen realm, how's the unseen realm structured. But one of the major differences was over the idea of continuous revelation. For a lot of Christians in this time period, the 17th century, in general, God had stopped revealing things. So there wasn't much revelation from the other realm. Now, within Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, there was still the possibility, conceptually, that unseen realm could break into this world through visions, through mystics like Teresa of Avila and others, right? Marian apparitions, some of the things we've already talked about. So there was that belief that those things could still happen, but in general, the idea was that revelation from that side had largely ceased, especially for Protestants, who had emphasized the Bible so much. The Bible was the complete revelation. There wasn't a need for Protestants for continuous revelation. Well, that wasn't something that was always compatible with African views of how the world and how the unseen world worked, especially as they considered the idea that the spirits could continuously talk to those in this world. What we do see very prominently, especially in that 17th century, is a hybrid relationship between African religions and Christianity. And so often, both missionaries and indigenous people, whether they were enslaved or whether they were in Africa, often kind of melded some of those concepts together. And so Christian missionaries kind of finding things in African culture and trying to Christianize them, put a Christian face on it, and saying, oh, well, this is like the concept of such and such. And so the other thing that would happen, especially among Catholic missionaries, was the hybridity between Catholic saints and the holy people spirits of African religions. And so kind of saying, well, this is just a misunderstanding of this particular saint, or this saint and that being are the same concept. But throughout the 17th century, and especially into the 18th century, although we see a lot of hybridity, especially in slave Christianity in the colonies, a majority of that expression was European Christianity practiced by slaves. We don't really see the development of slave Christianity, where these enslaved Africans took what they were being taught and made it their own until really the late 18th century, early 19th century. And so a lot of the ways that were practiced, a lot of the doctrine, the preaching was very much influenced by European views and European forms of conduct. Certainly we will say more about slavery as we go into the 18th century and certainly the 19th century. But I did want to pause here before we transition into talking about culture and society and ask if there were any questions that we needed to handle with respect to either slavery or politics as we're kind of moving here between these two topics. All right, let's move into culture and society. As we think about how Christianity and culture were interrelated in the 17th century, we have here as the foundation the Protestant Reformation. And what we begin to see in the 17th century especially is that individuals, especially in Europe, took some of the intellectual framework of the Reformation with respect to its challenging of authority, with its questioning of tradition, and the emphasis on the individual conscience. These things led some, at the time, Christians to begin to challenge certain held concepts about Christianity itself. And so the Reformers were about challenging Catholicism, the structure of Catholicism, church tradition. Well, some people began to take that and apply it to the Christian message in general. Others, however, firmly saw themselves as being Christians, but what they brought to Christianity often led to, down the line, people becoming more confident and comfortable in denying the truth of Christianity. And especially in philosophy, that becomes the case. There are three thinkers that I want to talk about just briefly and mention because of how important they are for later developments, especially in the 18th century and beyond. One of the most famous philosophers in the 17th century that had a rather significant impact in philosophy and mathematics as well is René Descartes. Frenchman, had been educated by Jesuits, but a lot of his philosophical development is influenced by his study of mathematics. And the certainty that is present in math was something that inspired Descartes to think about certainty philosophically. Can you have the same kind of certainty in philosophy and theology like you have in mathematics? I mean, 2 + 2 = 4. There isn't uncertainty about that. There isn't uncertainty about other mathematical principles. But when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to reality, Descartes said there is the beginnings of uncertainty. And a variety of philosophical movements and schools in the 18th century, the 17th century, 18th century, began examining this idea, especially when it comes to the issue of reality. How do you know reality exists? How do you know what's truly real? And so essentially, Descartes starts to try and find a method for determining reality. And so he starts from the position of, at least this is what he claimed, I'm going to refuse to believe anything unless it can be decisively shown that it's true. So I'm going to doubt everything unless I can know without a shadow of doubt that it's true. And so he starts off with this idea of, I'm going to doubt everything. But, this is the turn that happens in Descartes' thinking, the thing that he's most known for. He realizes in this process of doubting, there must be someone or something that exists to do the doubting. And so he comes up with this famous statement, I think, therefore I am. There is someone that has to be doing the thinking about doubting, so I must decisively exist. But that doesn't tell me much. Right? That doesn't tell me if my body is real. That doesn't tell me if the world around me is real. But I start from this position of I exist. Now what's interesting here is that when this discussion occurs, you take a philosophy course where Descartes talked about math, it's emphasized as this kind of breakthrough, and in a sense it is. But Descartes here is heavily dependent upon Luther's notions of the individual. Right? And so he brings up a lot of this, and so his commentary, Luther's commentary on Romans, is very influential here in Descartes' thinking. Eventually, he, of course, moves on to other aspects of existence, and the method that he is a part of, or the school he is a part of, is referred to as rationalism. The emphasis being on the reason's ability to determine objective truth. So I think, therefore I am. But then he moves beyond just I think, so I exist, to say that, okay, if I can conceive of something, if I can perceive of things, and I can perceive them as clearly and distinctly, right? The table before me, the walls, my body, they must exist as well for me to perceive them. Now, of course, perceptions can be misleading. The sun looks like a disk, but we know it's more of a sphere or a globe. But as we perceive it, it looks like a disk. Furthermore, of course, he moves to develop a rational proof for the existence of God. A version that's often referred to as the ontological argument. In my imperfection and my ability to be misled, I can still perceive of the notion of a perfect being. And so therefore, God must exist. Because how could somebody have imagined a perfect God unless God had existed? Because our experience is of imperfection. And so ultimately, Descartes has a very strong confidence in the rational powers of the human being to determine truth. And he still maintains that connection with Christianity. But what he's doing here is moving it beyond revelation. And he's not appealing to, well, Scripture says God exists, so God must exist. He's appealing to the powers of human reason. A second thinker, a little bit later than Descartes, and going a different direction than Descartes, is a man named Thomas Hobbes. Descartes was French, Hobbes was English, lived during the time period of the English Civil War. So kind of contemporary with Descartes, but Descartes doing his different things in France. And Hobbes is more interested in politics, truly, than philosophy. He's interested in about the state and how the state should work. But in his working out how that works, he also begins to do some things in philosophy. But his emphasis, instead of the powers of the human reason, is on the material world. And so Hobbes is very skeptical in some ways. He's convinced that only the material world exists, which of course brings into the question of supernaturalism. He never publicly comes out and denies the existence of God. But if the material world is the only thing that exists, what do you do about God? How do you understand God? And because of this emphasis on the material world, it is a rejection of revelation to some extent. And so it's a challenge to Christian political thought, which emphasized revelation, the importance of hierarchy as deemed by God. And so in his work, he tended to emphasize certain aspects of the state that move it away from that church-state concept that so many of even the Reformation thinkers had emphasized. His major political work is a work called Leviathan. And Leviathan here refers to the state and the broad, sweeping control that the state has. In Leviathan, Hobbes denies the existence of divinely established morality. And so this kind of rejection of God determining what's right and wrong. All laws, Hobbes said, are created by human beings to protect themselves from each other. So morality isn't about these kind of divine notions of good and evil, but about what's going to protect me from the people around me and keep me safe. And for that protection, said Hobbes, people must give up their liberties. And so we're willing to give up certain liberties to have protection. Which is, it almost sounds like you could hear Hobbes talking today with the ideas of security and privacy and what we're willing to give up to be protected from terrorism. Ideally for Hobbes, the state, the ideal state, seems to have been an absolute ruler, because that would provide absolute protection. And so there's heavy emphasis on the power of the state. But Hobbes is also much more pessimistic about human ability and nature. And Descartes was, human beings can determine reality. Hobbes isn't as convinced. And so the notion of the state and what the state represents is beginning to change here. It's not as much about this divinely inspired notions of government.